Ok. So, boa noite a todas e todos. Esse é o nosso terceiro encontro do novo módulo do nosso curso tradicional histórico, já são 7, 8 anos, talvez, desse espaço de quintas-feiras, 7h30, que fundamos há todo esse tempo, sem saber aonde ia nos conduzir. Começamos, alguns estão ainda desde o começo, e começamos lá atrás, uma sinagoga pequena, com alguma expectativa, e fomos crescendo, fomos para o auditório, para o salão nobre, e por aí vai. E continuamos aqui. Fomos renovando, mudando de temáticas, de modalidades, de módulos. E hoje estamos num novo módulo que chamamos ele de Magnetismos Judaicos. Magnetismos Judaicos. O que te prende, o que te atrai, o que te fascina do judaísmo. O que faz com que alguém dedique sua vida a estudar o judaísmo. E dessa vez, os convidados, as convidadas, são pessoas que não são rabinos e não são religiosos necessariamente. Pode ser que alguns sim, outros não. E decidiram dedicar sua vida aos estudos judaicos, a alguma disciplina. Tivemos, há 2 semanas atrás, professor de História, Joshua Holo, reitor do HC, do Seminário Rabínico, em Los Angeles, e nos contou um pouquinho de si próprio e depois, através de uma aula, por que decidiu dedicar sua vida a estudar a história judaica medieval. Qual era a fascinação? Na semana passada eu contei a vocês uma de minhas tantas fascinações, especificamente fascinação com o livro de Bereshit e especificamente com o relato da criação. E hoje, today, we have the pleasure and the honor of receiving here another scholar. Temos a honra, o prazer de receber uma outra personalidade do mundo acadêmico dos estudos judaicos, professora doutora Leah Hochman, que ensina filosofia judaica, disciplina próxima do meu coração e da minha atividade também, na Universidade do Sul de Califórnia e no Hebrew College também, seminário que prepara rabinos e educadores, talvez o maior do mundo, que faz essas duas coisas em forma integrada. E a professora doutora Leah Hochman foi especialmente recomendada, escolhida, entre todos os professores que estão lá, não somente pela disciplina, mas também pelo modo. E não somente pela disciplina e pelo modo, mas a forma em que ela aplica a disciplina da filosofia judaica a assuntos mundanos, cotidianos, como comida, como estética, a moral e a ética da aparência, e por aí vai. It's a huge pleasure and honor to have you here today with us. We are very thankful to you, Professor Dr. Leah Hochman, and we are very excited, not just for receiving you, for sure, but for the way you work on topics like Jewish philosophy, so important, so serious, so deep, but you relate them to things that used to be thought very lighter, like aesthetics or food. So let's begin our first part, our interview about you, and then we will receive our big answer by your lecture. So let me ask you, how come, why you decided to become a scholar of the Jewish studies, and why Jewish philosophy?
Thank you first. Let me just thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight and such a pleasure. It's really one of the smaller blessings of this experience that we're in, the world is in, to be able to Zoom to you in Brazil from my home in Los Angeles. I'm really honored and touched to be part of this series, and I thank you, Rabbi Sternschein, and also I want to thank Raquel and I want to thank Natan for their help with the production. And I want to thank everyone who's here, everyone, there's YouTube people, there's Facebook people, there are Zoom people. Thank you all for coming. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Ela está agradecendo a todos os que estão aqui presentes, se sente honrada com a oportunidade, obviamente com a ajuda de Natan e da Raquel, e mencionou especificamente os que estão no YouTube, os que estão no Facebook e os que estão aqui no Zoom.
It's like being at the UN. This is my closest I'll ever get to the UN. So I come from Seattle. I grew up in Seattle, Washington City, where I grew up. There was one of every single type in my class, in my friend group. And I went to college, to university in Southern California. And I had a class. I went to a very small school and I took a class on Jewish diaspora, where Jews lived in the world. And I remember very clearly there was one day in October, it was a fall semester class, and I had this moment in which we talked about a medieval Jewish woman. Her name was Gluckel, and she wrote a memoir, and the memoir was in Yiddish. And I had a reaction to the memoir. I did not like it. I have since come to love it, but at the time I hated it. And she described a world that was completely foreign to me, even though I felt very centered in my Jewish identity and I felt very clear about my religion. She was describing an experience that I did not. Spoke to my professor, and he pushed back on it a little bit. And in that moment, in a discussion with my professor, my fascination with Jews really was born. Who are Jews? Why are they the way that they are? What do they do? And what are they doing in other places? Right, this moment that hopefully every 18-year-old or 19-year-old experiences when they think outside of their own experience and they think about how other people have experiences. Then I went to Israel my junior year, my third year in university, and I studied with Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr, a Jewish philosopher. I think you also studied with him.
Yes, I studied with him also. The BA, I made a master. He was my mentor for the master and also for the PhD. Yeah. So I know him quite well.
Yeah. So he gave a class in Jewish philosophy, and it was as if the sort of to use a metaphor, the scales fell off my eyes. I had never thought the big thoughts in terms of Jews before. I had thought the big thoughts in terms of other people, but that there were Jewish questions. There were questions about what it meant to be in relationship with God, that what it meant to be part of a people, Israel, what it meant to be a Jew in the 19th century, what it meant to be a Jew before the Holocaust, which also had not occurred to me, what it meant to be a Jew after the Holocaust. This survey of classes for me was life-altering. And I took another class with him, and I came back to the United States, and I took more philosophy classes, and I went directly to a doctoral program in religion and literature rather than philosophy. And I did that because I really like the way that fiction and literature, poetry and memoir, the way that people tell their stories can unpack the big questions without being, they can be exploratory without being sort of autocratic, without being really preaching, without telling people what they had to believe, but rather showing people what one believes. That to me was beautiful. I happen also to be the younger sister of two older brothers, and that makes me a contrarian, someone who is oppositional in some ways. And I was in a philosophy class about the 18th century, and that is my favorite century, the 18th century. And we were doing a dictionary of philosophical terms. And people were taking really beautiful terms, the beautiful and the good, justice, honor. And I decided to be oppositional, to be the opposite. And I took the word ugly. And what I found when I took the word ugly was that people used the word ugly for Jews. That was also not on my radar. I didn't think about that. And what I uncovered for me was the bringing together of my loves for literature and my love for popular culture and my love for visual images and my love about how people think about Jews and how Jews think about themselves. So that's how I came, and I wrote on a famous Jewish German philosopher named Moses Mendelssohn. He wrote specifically on the study of beauty, but he has a beautiful theory of ugliness that makes ugliness better than beauty. Some other day I will come and teach that to your group. But it is a beautiful story because Moses Mendelssohn himself was a hunchback and was perceived as ugly. So he writes a philosophy about the way that people think about him. That to me is exactly my kettle of fish, if that's an idiom that translates.
Okay, just a second. I will just summarize a little bit for the people that is not so accustomed to the arts, the English. Anyway, então ela nos diz que ela começou a pensar com 18 anos, mais ou menos, através de curso sobre os judeus em geral, que era fascinante se pensar quem são os judeus, como são os judeus de diversos lugares, como e por que são os judeus como são, onde vivem, bem além das experiências limitadas dela mesma. Esse foi o primeiro empurrão que ela recebeu na biografia dela a começar a se dedicar a estas coisas. E o seguinte passo foi, estando em Israel, aparentemente por um tempo limitado, e acabou fazendo curso com professor que foi também meu mentor do mestrado, do doutorado, o professor Paul Mendes Flor, e ele trouxe para ela por primeira vez perguntas profundas sobre o sentido, qual é o significado e o sentido da espiritualidade, do divino, da existência, da vida, do bem, e por aí vai. E aí tomou outros cursos com Mendes Flor também, e voltou aos Estados Unidos e pegou outros cursos também de filosofia, mas acabou decidindo entrar num programa que ia se dedicar principalmente à literatura, porque queria trazer essas questões que lhe interessavam a ela, do pensamento e do ser, de modo não autoritário, de modo descritivo, convite a ver os modos do ser, estético, suave, leve, experimental, e não autoritário, não pregando. E contou também que ela é a irmã mais nova, e por isso era contrária, gostava de ser contrária, e assim é que, num momento determinado, quando na sala estavam trabalhando na elaboração de um dicionário de conceitos em geral e filosóficos e demais. Todos buscavam os conceitos positivos, o bem, o certo, o correto, o justo, o belo. Ela foi buscar justamente o conceito do feio. E queria ver o que significa isso. Quem estabelece o feio? Em que consiste isso? E estava se trabalhando o século XVIII, e ela chegou ao pensador, ao filósofo Moses Mendelssohn, que é uma figura super conhecida, ele é humilde, diz, talvez conheçam, enfim, e o Moses Mendelssohn justamente tinha escrito algo sobre estas questões, e especificamente aplicadas ao judeu. O judeu era visto especialmente como exemplo do feio, e aí ela encontrou a confluência de todas as coisas juntas. O que interessava a ela dos grandes assuntos existenciais, do ser, os modos de ser judeu, a arte, a estética, a moral e a ética, e um dia, eventualmente, vai nos contar o que ela encontrou, porque ela chegou à conclusão de que existe algo positivo no conceito do feio. Mais positivo ainda do que no conceito do belo. Eu já assisti um TED Talk sobre isso dela, que é maravilhoso, mas eventualmente um dia convidamos ela a que nos conte isso. I say that
I got it. You're very expressive. It's incredible.
But I say that it is interesting to pay attention to your reflection about the positive side of the ugliness, but I didn't say why and how. Okay, so
that's good. We'll keep them wanting more.
Exactly. Okay, so please go. So our question for today, our main question for today, is how can you explain us your fascination as a whole regarding Judaism or Jewish thought by means of a lecture? So we decided together that the lecture will be around food.
Yes.
So tell us, what is so fascinating for you on Judaism, on Jewish thought, and on Jewish thought about food?
So here's the other thing about me, is that I like to eat. I like it a lot. And I like the idea of eating. There is an old joke about, someone asks, what's the story about Jewish history? And the joke goes, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Right? Yes. Jewish history in a nutshell. And what's interesting about that is that food can tell us so much about ourselves, but we often don't stop to think about what it is that we're eating, why we are choosing it, and what it means that we're eating it, and what it means when we choose it. So I want to unpack with you what the idea of food is, rather than just think about foods or just think about recipes. I want to think about more deeply the meaning of our choices and the way in which ideas about food can tell us all kinds of really interesting information about ourselves, about our assumptions, and about our cultural attachment.
Okay, just the questions in order to go with you. Yeah. Então, ela responde porque eu disse, bom, nossa pergunta de hoje principal é que é o que te fascina nos estudos judaicos em geral, na filosofia judaica em particular e na filosofia judaica aplicada à comida. Então, primeiro, ela responde que gosta de comer e se pergunta e acha que na pergunta e na resposta a como escolhemos, encontramos muito sobre quem somos. E agora vai nos explicar como.
Okay.
Please.
So we're going to talk about the meaning of food, right? And those assumptions about the meanings of food. So normally I would ask for a volunteer, but I'm going to just ask you to volunteer. Tell me what you ate last night for dinner.
Ok, aí algum voluntário, voluntária que possa dizer o que comeu da última vez, no último jantar, qual foi sua escolha, hoje ou ontem. Diga, Paula. Vamos abrir o microfone, Nathan.
Okay. I ate soup, vegetables soup.
Is that it?
Soup.
Only vegetable soup?
Yeah, with chicken. Yeah.
Chicken in the soup?
Yes, in the soup, yeah.
Did you make the soup or did you buy it? Have it?
My husband's grandmother.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Was there so vegetables and chicken, was there rice in the soup or was it sort of clear?
No rice, no.
Okay.
No. Potatoes.
What
carrots.
else did you have?
Oh, just that and water. It was a pretty simple dinner, not really special, but I just want and for dessert, some chocolate.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for volunteering.
Oh, no problem.
Now I want to ask everyone to think for just a second, what is it that we can learn about Paula from that meal? What can we know about her from just what she said? She described it as a simple soup. Her husband's grandmother made it. It had vegetables. She started with vegetables, but it actually had chicken in it, right? And it was a simple soup with potatoes and carrots. If it got more complicated as you talked about it, right? What are some things that we can know? So Rabbi, let me ask you, what do you think? What can you think? What can you learn? What can you discern from just that description?
Ok. Ela está me perguntando, viram que a Paula respondeu que comeu uma sopa de verduras, de vegetais, e que depois acrescentou que tinha também
Don't add to the recipe, by the way.
Yes, I'm just...
Yeah, I'm just saying, but don't add.
Summarizing. Ok. So, e agora me pergunta, o que podemos aprender disso? A pergunta é a todo mundo, quem quiser responder, me salvar, me ajudar, por favor. Mas minha resposta, I say that if anyone would like to answer or to help me, it will be kind. But I think that, first of all, we can learn. I have never thought about that, but no, but
yeah, great.
It's amazing.
That's already good.
The question, to ask is the key to think. So this is a huge.
Volunteered to help you.
Okay, but I need to answer now. I had already thought a little bit. So I think first of all, there's one assumption in her thought or in her values that show that for her, for any reason, vegetables are more acceptable than chicken, or are more important, or are more legal.
Recipe was
legal. I don't know, because she began with the vegetables and the chicken came afterwards.
They were more prominent. I mean, I don't know that they're more valuable, but they were more prominent. I wouldn't want to assume about her so much, but you could say that they were more prominent. That was the more important aspect of the soup.
Maybe.
Yeah?
But the detail of the potatoes came afterwards. I don't know what does this mean. And I think it was lovely, or interesting at least, that the husband's mother was part of the issue, because it brings to the scene something related to relationships, maybe even to her history. Ok. Então eu disse que aparentemente os vegetais eram mais importantes, tinham um status mais legittimo do que o frango e que o fato de trazer a sogra à cena podia dizer algo a respeito da história deles. André Melmelstein, there is another contribution for the analysis. Please, answer you too.
Hi, really interesting conversation. I love food myself. So now what drew my attention is that what she did not eat, because she didn't have, she didn't order dinner from a restaurant. She didn't have industrialized food, but she had a home cooked meal. We can say a very traditional comfort food, especially made by the husband's grandmother. So I think it also tells us something, right? What kind of food it is, and it doesn't matter that much to me if it's soup or stew or pasta, but well, especially being a chicken soup, it's very Jewish also. but draw my attention the fact that she was eating like properly home cooked food.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Right. What she told us is as important as what she didn't tell us, right? What wasn't part of it, right? So had she ordered something, like say she had ordered something to be delivered, right? Now things are being delivered much more frequently. Then we would have known something about a sense of disposable income. There might have been something about access. We would know something we don't know anything about whether she was an organic eater, but we do know that she eats chicken, right? But the way that she described it as simple is really important, right? But we also know that she has a family structure here, and that that's a multi-generational family structure, and that it extends not just as her own individual self, but also as part of her family, right? That it's her husband's grandma, it's not her grandma. And then that's really important. It's usually those kinds of things are gifts of love, right? And there is a sense there of a family dynamic that's folded in this. It's a simple eating, but a comfort eating, right? So we can know some things about what's interesting, the tastes, but we can also know things about I'm sure it was a more simple, like less of an ethnic soup. I mean, I don't think it was Vietnamese pho. I think it probably was a vegetable soup that has a sort of a native sense of wherever your husband's grandmother came from, right? And that's what we can know. There is also a choice about ethnic eating or other kinds of cosmopolitanism. So if I had asked, that we can find so much information about people based on what they eat or what they choose to eat. And the same thing can happen in virtually any kind of context. So I want to give you another example, right? That if I show you my water bottle, okay, here's my water bottle, right? My water bottle, without even saying anything out loud, can tell you all kinds of information about me, right? So here's my water bottle. You are thinking thoughts about me based on my bottle, right? What happens if I had this bottle instead? Does your perception of who I am change if I have this bottle, this water? Does your perception change if I use this instead? Right? Or is it somehow different if I have this fancy water bottle that can keep it cold for long periods of time? Right? Mm-hmm. The same thing can happen if I came in with a Starbucks cup, right? I know that Sao Paulo is the coffee capital of the world. So if I walked into a talk with you with a Starbucks cup, would that change if I had my own homemade cup or if I went to one of the 10,000 artisan little cafes, right? Or should I not be walking around with coffee? Isn't coffee something that you should sit and drink, right? If I'm already transporting it. In other words, I expose all kinds of information about myself in a nonverbal way, and you perceive data about me without me even telling you. So I tell you about my economic status. I tell you about if I'm in a hurry. I tell you about my tastes, right? What I prefer, what I don't prefer. I tell you about my sense of being hurried or my tiredness, right? Or my excitability. I show you my preferences. It's the same kind of data, the same kind of information that we share with our clothing, with our hairstyles, with our glasses, right? With our people who wear earrings or people who choose not to wear earrings. There is another form of non-verbal information with which we share other people with food. And what I want us to talk about is, what do we think about other people and ourselves when we really pay attention to what we think of as Jewish food?
Great. So, então ela diz, ela também trouxe algumas análises ao redor da sopa da Paula. Vamos deixá-la por tempinho, porque foram exemplos, simplesmente. Ela depois mostrou diversos tipos de recipientes de água, por exemplo. Nos mostrou a garrafa que ela usa e que aconteceria se usasse outras. Nos mostrou várias. E trouxe depois o exemplo do café, no país do café. Então, como veríamos uma pessoa que toma o café de Starbucks, ou um café instantâneo, ou que prepara seu café em casa, pode andar com café pela rua, e se tomasse um café grande ou pequeno, ou tem que se sentar num lugar tal ou qual, se não toma café. O café talvez está dizendo se está acordada, com vitalidade, ou está cansada. Se talvez o café fala também sobre, não somente sobre seus gostos, mas também sobre sua classe social, sobre seu estado de ânimo, sobre seu tempo, a que se dedica, se está com pressa. E assim por diante. O café, a comida em geral, diz, essa é a grande conclusão e o que vai nos levar à próxima parte, diz muito a respeito da pessoa, assim como os óculos que podemos usar, a roupa, a forma em que nos sentamos e como falamos. Existe muita informação não verbal que transmitimos com mais ou menos consciência sobre coisas extremamente importantes ou não, também na comida. Please.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I have a couple of slides to share with us.
Please. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think it will work. Yeah.
Yes.
So
great.
We're gonna talk about foodways, and foodways are the cultural, religious, social, economic, and political practices that are related to food consumption and production. When we talk about that, we can think about Jewish food. It can tell us about Jewish history. It can tell us about Jewish identity. It can tell us about the relationships between people who have moved from one place to another, and the ways in which the foods that they bring with them adapt to new places and change identity based on those new places, those new flavors, and those new senses of taste.
Então, essas questões que falamos antes, ela vai tentar trazê-las para o estudo dos judeus, do judaísmo, através da comida judaica. Assim como mostrou antes, a comida pode nos apresentar questões culturais, religiosas, sociais, econômicas, políticas, práticas de todo tipo, formas de consumir e de produzir, né? Valores. E como as coisas se levaram de um lado para outro, os gostos, os tons, os condimentos, os ingredientes e demais.
There's an 18th century, he was a politician and a lawyer, a French cultural critic named Jean Brillat-Savarin, and he was the first one to really say what we all know in an intuitive way, right? Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you what you are. Food is a marker of the values that we employ in every day of our lives. So you don't have to answer these questions, but I want you to think about them. Where do you shop? How much do you cook? And how much do you rely on other people to provide food for you? How much do you eat out or order in? And how much do you cook, or do you bake, or do you just simply assemble, right? In the pandemic, our food behaviors have changed so significantly, but I wonder whether our senses of taste, and taste is a funny word, it's flavor, right? But also a sense of refinement, a sense of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So I want you to ask yourself, what kind of food do you find yourself gravitating to? And is it Jewish food? What would it mean to be a Jewish food?
Okay. This is a question for the audience? No.
No, it's a thought question.
Okay,
Yeah.
please.
So in the United States, there was a very famous comedian named Lenny Bruce, who was famous for really being on the edge of comedy. And he had a very famous routine in which he delineated, he categorized, he separated Jewish food from Goyish food, non-Jewish food. And he made all these references to very specific American foods and said, this is Jewish, this is not Jewish, right?
Mm.
What I found interesting, I have learned so much about Brazilian food, is that you cannot make those distinctions in Brazilian Jewish food at all, because the lines are not clear. They're not stark. There is a much easier integration of Jewish foods and Brazilian foods, because Brazilian food is such an interesting mix of different tastes and flavors.
Mm-hmm. Wait.
Okay.
You said many things that
Okay.
I think it's so important that I would not like people to lose it. Então, são algumas pérolas bem importantes, eu acho. Uma é a questão, o pequeno jogo de palavras que ela fez, ou a atenção que nos colocou para a palavra taste, sabor, ou gosto. Que nós usamos isso normalmente em todas as línguas para falar em comidas, mas também metaforicamente para falar em atitudes. Uma piada de mau gosto, por exemplo. Eu estava tentando buscar alguma tradução em português. Mau gosto. Em espanhol também existe muito isso. No espanhol que se fala em Uruguai, por exemplo, se diz me sabe mal. Me sabe mal, que significa sinto um mau gosto quando tenho que te dizer uma coisa que não é legal. Me deixa um mau gosto. Tivemos sin sabor, se diz em espanhol. Ta'am, em hebraico, significa gosto, sabor, mas é também o sentido. Quando se fala sentido das mitzvot, qual é o significado? Se diz ta'amei a mitzvot. Capítulos e capítulos do Maimônides sobre os sentidos das mitzvot, se diz ta'am, gosto. As músicas da Parashá, da Torá, que a gente lê, se chamam ta'amei a mikra, ta'am. É também taste, é também gosto. Então, essa é uma coisa muito importante. A outra falou sobre quem define que é comida goi e comida judia. Nos Estados Unidos tem regras claras, e um comediante, Lenny Bruce, estabelecia aí várias coisas que são goi ou que são judias. E não necessariamente tem a ver com o judaísmo, mas na cultura americana isso é de judeu e isso não é de judeu, e ela diz que pesquisou que no caso brasileiro é bem diferente. Não somente por se tratar de outras comidas, e sim porque estão mais misturadas. Please. No, it's okay.
I didn't mean to go so fast. Okay. So I want to introduce a concept that comes from Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was a French anthropologist, called the Culinary Triangle. Mm-hmm. The Culinary Triangle gives us some really important data about how to understand the contexts by which we understand cultural, and religious tastes, right? And although Jews take their food very seriously, each one of us is very beholden to the contexts in which we are operating. And Brazilian food makes that a really interesting series of what is possible to eat and what is not possible to eat. So this theory, generated by the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, helps us understand cultural assumptions about food. Okay, so at the top of the triangle is food that is raw. On the left side is food that's cooked, and on the right side is food that is rotted. The question is, what does he mean by these categories, right? Raw food is natural. It's straight from the field. It is uncultivated. It is not produced, not handled in any way. It's wild. It's uncivilized food. Cooked food is food that has been, in his terms, elaborated. So it's been manipulated in some way. It's been, I'm in Los Angeles, I'll use the word produced in some way. It's gone through the process of culture. So when you eat a raw vegetable, for example, most people aren't eating it right out of the ground, right? It's been washed, it's been cut, it's been put on a plate, and it's been aesthetically, it's been pleasingly put on that plate. All the vegetables that we eat have been produced in some way or processed in some way. That makes it cooked in this concept, right? Lévi-Strauss argues that everything that we eat is cooked food in one way or another because it has gone through the process of being culturally acceptable. So if it's been washed, if it's been boiled, if it's been broiled, if it's been cut, then it's a cooked food. And rotted food is food that we find unacceptable. It's food that we reject. It's inedible food. It's the trash. It's the food that we reject for one reason or another.
Ok.
You want to translate that? Yeah.
Ela está trazendo umas categorias que propôs o antropólogo judeu Claude Lévi-Strauss no ano 66, que diz que existem três categorias que vão se misturar, de algum modo, três extremos, vamos ver como usa, que é o cru, digamos, o cozido e o podre. Mas o que significa isso, basicamente? O cru é o selvagem, a comida como ela se encontra solta na natureza, sem nenhum tipo de intervenção humana. Na hora que a pessoa pega, corta, lava, serve, seleciona, mistura, já não é a primeira categoria, já não é raw, é cooked, é cozido, é elaborado, tem uma intervenção humana, em algum nível. Intervenção humana já não está naquele extremo, já está nessa outra categoria. A terceira é aquilo que é inaceitável. Isso não é comida, isso eu rechaço, isso rejeito, não consumo, não aceito como comida. Então, essas são as três categorias.
So if you think about it for a second, how do we know that some food is not good for us? So if we think about milk, for example, how do we know when milk is bad? One way we know is because it stinks, right? It smells bad. Another way we know is that it looks bad and it curdles. Another way is that if it clunks, right? If it sounds like it's already changed, then we know it's rotted, right? So we know not to eat that because our senses, our sense of taste will actually tell us that it's inappropriate to eat. It's bad biologically for us. But another way that we know food is rotted is because it has a date on it. And the date will tell us, even if our senses do not tell us the same thing. And another way that we know that food is bad is that the other people in our community also don't eat it. So there is the way by which we ourselves, our senses keep us. There is the way in which our government or our regulations tell us that this is yes and this is no. And there are also all kinds of assumptions that go into telling us what food we can eat and what food we cannot eat.
Great. Então a última categoria, essa categoria do que rejeitamos, do que não é aceitável, vem de três possíveis processos diferentes. Um está relacionado com os nossos sentidos. Nos cheiramos, nos vemos, a consistência, e nos ouvimos. Dava o exemplo de um pão que está mal, ou uma leite, ou um leite, enfim. Outro critério é as regulamentações. Tem uma data de caducidade. E o terceiro é nosso meio social. Tem coisas que as pessoas comuns não comem. Então, de algum modo, estamos falando de três assuntos. As barreiras pessoais, biológicas ou de outro tipo. As regulamentações do poder, a política, as instituições, a cultura. E a questão social, meu grupo, ao qual eu pertenço. Please go ahead.
Okay, so if we think about the next example might be cheese, right? What is cheese? At its core, cheese is rotted milk, right? So there are some times when we can eat milk that's bad, but because it's good, right? And there are certain cheeses that are, of course, more rotted than other cheeses. So the idea of the culinary triangle isn't necessarily food that's actually rotted, but rather the ways that we perceive what food is possible and what food we reject, right? So if we think, there's a very famous example of American soldiers who had landed in France as in the end of the Second World War. And they were marching across France, and they came to a dairy, and they smelled something rotted. So they figured the cow had died, and they burnt down the dairy. Turns out that it was a cheese making dairy, and that they were aging cheese. And because their palate didn't know that was, basically expensive cheese that they had just completely destroyed, they understood it as rotted. So the context by which we know what's cooked and what's rotted also changes. They're not static at all, they're dynamic.
A forma de decidir que alguma coisa se encontra numa dessas categorias, especialmente a categoria do que rejeitamos, do que é rejeitável, do que é inaceitável, é algo bastante cultural, que estará muito relacionado com o que sabemos, e com o que assumimos, e com os nossos valores, e com os costumes. Assim, conta a história dos soldados americanos que terminaram num território francês e estavam do lado de uma fábrica de queijo forte e pensaram que se tratava de um lugar onde, com certeza, tinha morrido alguma vaca, alguma coisa assim, e acabaram destruindo o que não deviam.
So let me add another layer, because obviously when we're talking about Jewish food, it's not just individual tastes or cultural tastes, but there is a whole nother level by which the commandments, the halacha, the understanding of what's possible, what's cooked, what's kosher, and what's treif is not, and what's abominable, what's taboo, what's excluded is not determined by individuals or by communities, but rather by the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, right? So a British anthropologist named Mary Douglas, who writes beautifully on questions about purity, she gives us another triangle that I want to put together with the Levi-Strauss triangle. And hers, you can see at the top is holy, is at the top of the triangle. On one side is what we eat at the table, and at the other side is what we don't eat, what we reject, what's treif, what's not kosher, what is actually forbidden.
Então,
Oh, do you want to
no,
do this? Yeah, go ahead.
no, I think it was quite clear.
Okay,
Outra
great.
antropóloga que está colocando essas categorias muito mais relacionadas aos estándares judaicos. Devem saber, e se não é um bom momento para pincelar que existe o conceito de que a mesa é um altar, que nós santificamos a comida. Nós dizemos bênçãos e nós escolhemos que, como, com qual processo e demais. Então, num extremo do esquema do pensamento está o conceito da santificação da comida, num outro extremo se encontra a ideia da mesa, a mesa em si mesma, a funcionalidade, e o terceiro é o abominável, o inaceitável, o que é tarefa, o que não é kasher, o que é proibido, o que está fora, e assim.
Right. And she also, because she's an anthropologist, she's interested in applying that not just into the category of what foods can be eaten, but the way that that triangle of what is offered to God, what is available for us, and what is rejected, to think about that in terms of the relationships between the people who are actually eating or not eating together. So you can see one triangle is her original triangle, the holy altar, the table, and the abomination. But she also uses that to think about the ways in which Israelite society itself was sort of made into a hierarchy, how it was prioritized, right? The Israelites are the holy, the allies you can eat with, and the enemies you reject, right? And even within Israelite society itself, you also see the Kohanim, the high priests, are the holy, the Israelites are acceptable, and everyone else is actually on the outs, right? Is rejected. So what she thinks of is the Culinary Triangle as a way of thinking about society, of what we find possible, what we hold as sacred, and what we reject completely.
Okay. Again, I think
the
words simplesmente que a Mary Douglas leva isso além da comida e usa esse esquema para ver o modo da sociedade judaica e os relacionamentos dentro dela e os conceitos do dentro, do fora, do próximo, do outro e principalmente dos caminhos, das aspirações, né? A que se aspira, que é o mais elevado, que é o mais baixo, que é bom e assim por diante.
So thank you. So what I would normally do is I would walk us through a bunch of different kinds of Jewish foods in order to really think about the history of those foods and the way that they represent ideas and projections about what Jews eat. But I see us running a little bit out of time. So what I want to do is really think much more specifically about this dish, which everyone I hope can recognize. I don't know that it's the best version of it because do you recognize what that food is? I think yes. I might be able to.
Feijoada.
Yes, exactly. So I don't know that there's a better example for what I'm talking about what is acceptable and what is rejected than the Brazilian national dish, right? Because primarily it's made with pork, right? And all kinds of meat. So even as Brazilian Jews navigate what it means to be both Brazilian and Jewish, there are certain lines, there are certain boundaries that they are willing and unwilling to cross. And one of those boundaries happens to be the adaptation of this Brazilian dish. I mean, Brazilian cuisine is very regional. You don't need me to tell you about Brazilian cuisine. It's very regional. It has a long history of different kinds of tastes and flavors. Some of it is immigrant and some of it is native. But the way that Ashkenazi Jews who come to Brazil primarily in the 20th century, they navigate what it means to make a dish that is primarily a pork dish, either vegetarian or using solely beef, is a prime example of the sort of what's cooked and what's rotted. In other words, what are the lines by which we understand what's acceptable to us as eaters, as parts of a larger eating community, and what do we reject? Maybe you eat, right? Maybe you wouldn't eat this on Shabbat, or maybe you would only eat it on Rosh Hashanah, right? And in other words, what we did with the soup at the beginning, I would want to encourage you to examine how it is that you have used the Brazilian national dish as an aspect of Jewish experience. When is it eaten? Is it a Shabbat food? Is it a Rosh Hashanah food? Is it explicitly not Shabbat food? Is Ashkenazi food the only food that's available for you on Shabbat? In other words, what is it that you are expressing in your own personal culinary triangle that can tell you about what you're doing to navigate the distinctions between different groups and integrating yourself into the group in which you want to be a part? The second part of that is the way in which your moral values play into your food choices. And in this regard, I would suggest a thought exercise on what the culinary triangle of the synagogue might be. What foods do you serve at your synagogue events? Are they different kinds of foods for senior events? Are they other foods for kids events? What are the values that you use to determine what should be served? What are the priorities? Is it organic food or is it price, right? By what way do we organize what's possible, what's edible, what's cooked, and what do we understand as rotted? Do you want to translate that?
Yes,
it's clear?
Okay. This is a very interesting exercise. I'm not sure if people will join ou we take the opportunity to do that, but I think it's great. Então, ela nos propõe os seguintes exercícios. Pensar, ela entende que a comida, depois de mostrar a feijoada, está tentando, disse claramente que é claro que existe, ela sabe que no Brasil existem muitas comidas regionais, muitas características regionais, mas mesmo assim, e que os judeus vão transitando em função do lugar, das regiões onde eles vão vivendo. E que algumas coisas foram incorporadas mais ou menos por uns ou por outros, mas a pergunta poderia ser, já que essa incorporação tem a ver também, de algum modo, com a identidade brasileira, com a identidade judaica, de um grupo, de um indivíduo, de uma família. Então, observem as comidas que vocês comem do Brasil. Quais foram incorporadas, quais não, quais foram incorporadas em quais circunstâncias, quais seriam aceitáveis de serem parte da celebração. Ou seja, existe alguma comida brasileira que eu comeria especificamente em Rosh Hashanah, ou em Yom Kippur, ou para terminar o Yom Kippur, ou no Shabbat? Existem comidas que não comeria? Existem comidas que escolheria especialmente para tal ocasião, judaica, alguma comida brasileira. Outro dia eu ouvi uma conversa, uma família que dizia, a gente gosta muito de sushi. I'm giving an example quite local to help, to reinforce what you are saying, because I think the challenge is great. I have heard some people of one family that they like sushi, but they say, oh, sushi is not for Shabbat.
Yeah, that's
they like sushi, no, not for Shabbat. Okay, so existem então comidas que não vamos comer justamente no Shabbat, ou não em Rosh Hashanah, ou não em Pesach, independentemente da halakha. Existem outras que especialmente sim, para alguns sim, para outros não. E também ela coloca esse desafio para celebrações comunitárias. Que comidas comemos quando fazemos um kiddush? Ou quando fazemos um kiddush de sexta ou de sábado? ou quando fazemos de Pesach, ou se fizermos uma comida de Shabbat à noite. E se fosse somente para Noar, para os jovens, traríamos outras coisas? E se fosse almoço, fosse jantar, fosse de Sukkot, ou fosse... Aqui é bom que esteja a Raquel trabalha conosco na produção, e escolhemos muitas vezes as comidas juntos, que é aceitável. E se fosse uma atividade para crianças, do grupo de Yeladim, da Rebeca, que traríamos? E quais seriam os critérios? Que a criança importa menos, que a criança precisa de mais proteínas ou precisa de mais calorias, tem que ser mais orgânico, tem que ser mais barato, tem que ser mais tradicional, tem que ser mais leve, mais rápido, mais jovem.
So I think also, I mean, what's interesting, just the examples that I just was showing while you were translating, right? The example of the sushi, which there are, specific forms of sushi that are only served in São Paulo that are not served in Japan. I mean,
Yes.
The largest population of Japanese outside of Japan happen to be in your city, right? And also the largest group of Italians outside of Italy, right? So that the idea of having lox on pizza, right, is anybody 100 years ago would freak out with that idea. How could you put those two things together, lox and pizza, right? But also, how the way in which the sushi buffet, that's very much a Brazilian invention, right? But to bring those together is actually one of the most interesting parts, I think, about the way that Jews navigate, is that there are other ethnicities within, particularly São Paulo, that the Jewish community in some ways is not like the other communities, even though it has used different ways to think about the integration of food. It still has retained an Ashkenazi sense of distinctions among food. So just your example of you can't have sushi on Shabbat, right? For many people, if sushi is totally normal, then it's not special enough for Shabbat, right? And that sense of what is holy, what is at the top of the triangle, what is offered, is a way in which Jews navigate their identity through food.
Exactly. That was by the way, that was the argument of the children of a family about bring or not sushi for Shabbat.
Right.
So one say, sushi is my favorite. And Shabbat is favorite. But the other one say, but sushi is regular. It's favorite, but it's regular. I don't want it for Shabbat.
Right.
Okay, so.
Right.
Então, está justamente reforçando essas coisas, que é especial. Como se dá essa relação de integração? Talvez entre Ashkenazim é diferente do que entre Sefaradim, entre famílias de um tipo ou de outro, de uma região ou outra, de uma idade ou outra, que é especial, que então pode ser sagrado ou festivo o suficiente, que é regular, né? Por exemplo, sushi aqui é muito comum, porque tem sushis que são muito brasileiros. Não sei se todos sabem disso, mas os japoneses, que não tem nada a ver com os japoneses do Brasil, muitas vezes não reconhecem a maioria das peças do nosso sushi. Então, enfim, existem esses desafios.
Do you want to give me a thought about time? Because I see that I don't want to. I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions if there's still a question. Yeah,
Sure.
But I mean, I can sum up. There's a lot to say. There's so much more to say. But what I want to encourage people to think really deeply about what it is that what's happening with their own culinary triangles, because I think the way in which we use that as a investigative tool, not just for our tastes, what pleases us and what displeases us, or not even really how we think of ourselves in the world, but to use it as a moral tool, a way in which we can evaluate our values, the ways in which we understand an ethical system and the tension between values, the way that we prioritize our tastes. And here I don't mean flavor profiles. Here I mean the way in which we think of what's proper behavior and what's improper behavior.
Mm.
So what kind of food behaviors? Environmental concerns, paying people a fair wage, where food comes from, the way in which meat is slaughtered, the way the workers in those meat plants are treated. How do our foodways, our individual and our community foodways, play out on our own individual triangles? And what kind of recalibration might be possible when we think of our food in an intellectual, in a moral way, rather than simply as an Epicurean, as this tastes good and this doesn't taste good.
Great. Thank you. Ela nos deixa perguntas. Como é que talvez deveríamos recalibrar nossas escolhas culinárias, uma vez que vamos descobrindo que elas se relacionam com muitos assuntos, não somente com costumes e com preços e com disponibilidade, mas também com valores éticos, valores morais. Quando nós nos perguntamos se algo é adequado ou não, é correto ou não, em termos culinários, ele se refere ao quê? A que isso é mais sustentável, a que isso é mais saudável, a que o processo da produção dessa comida é mais ético ou não, é mais ético para com quem? Para com o agricultor, para com o produtor. Vou ou não vou a tal restaurante em função de como se trata aí as pessoas, ou como se trata aí a comida, como se trata aí a limpeza. Buscamos algo mais orgânico, algo mais saudável para mim, para o planeta, para a pessoa. Em que medida esses valores são os que regem e os que decidem? E se não são, talvez em que medida teríamos que revisitá-los e redesenhar nossos critérios éticos e morais na hora de nos expressar através de nossa comida. Muito, muito bom. Muito, muito bom. Muito, thank you. Thank you so much. I think it is such a new approach to food and to the possibility of apply philosophy or moral thought to food. It's very, very interesting. I think, penso que se tiver já intervenções ou perguntas ou reações, Raquel, se quiser mandá-las por aqui, já podemos vê-las. Enquanto isso, eu já vou trazer alguma minha. So, in the meantime, until we receive maybe interventions or questions or reactions from any kind, I will ask my questions. My question I will deliver to you my humble reflection. I am wondering about first of all, I think I will try to say two or three questions, and that will be all for the moment. One is, if you find any of our thinkers, classical or others, that you can relate to this very analysis of food and ethic, or food and society, or food and Jewish society, or food and Jewish ethics. If you can see any one of our thinkers, of our texts related directly to that, I don't know. I am absolutely. This is a shelatam. Absolutely, I'm asking that. And the other one is, if you see any value on the practices of blessings before and after the meals that can promote or inhibit those values or this kind of analysis, and the same about the rules of kashrut or other rituals or other costumes, again minagim. If do you think that there is in the classical food, Ashkenazi food, gefilte fish or neidalech or farfalech or other traditional food, any sort of ethical thought to add to our thought?
So yes, three questions. The first answer is there's a lot to be said about food in our sources that people just haven't paid attention to because they haven't thought to pay attention to it. So one example is Maimonides, and Maimonides is so concerned about physical health because you can't be spiritually healthy, you can't be morally healthy unless you're physically healthy. So he has
you cannot.
No.
Yeah, that's it.
Right. So and he says very clearly, if you are unable to pray, then what you need to do is you have to eat a good meal, and you have to take a walk in a garden, and you have to take a good night's sleep. So that's one aspect. But also Nachmanides says very clearly that to have a meat-based diet is actually to clutter up one's psychic connections with God. And so he's a proponent of vegetarianism. Those are two medieval thinkers.
Say it again, please.
A meat-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
To have a meat-based diet is to complicate, is to clutter, or to make a stickier spiritual relationship with God. And if one eats vegetarian, then one is actually having a sort of a cleaner, that's a 21st century term, but a cleaner relationship with God. So those are from medieval sources.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, about 10 years ago, there was a crisis in a meatpacking company in Iowa, central United States, called the Agro-Processors Meatpacking Plant. And they were the premier, the dominant kosher meat packing company in the United States. They had completely taken over the market. And they were using illegal immigrants, and they were using child labor. So they were raided by the government, and then went out of business. Somebody else bought it. And there was a moral reckoning for Jews in the United States in particular about what constitutes kosher meat. In other words, what does kosher meat? Because the idea of being fit or proper is so in flux, right? It becomes in flux. So in the last 20 years, there have been a lot of people writing about the moral conundrums, the moral complexities of eating kosher. So there's a lot within to explore there.
Or the kosher aspect.
Yeah. What does it mean to be kosher? Right.
Exactly. The ethical aspect of the kosher concept.
Right.
Yes.
So then there's a question about, there's a bunch of Jewish values that are part of that, right? Bal tashchit, do not destroy, and Tsar Baalei Chaim, with the compassion for animals, but also Oshek, which is taking care of workers, paying workers on time, and also the crucial aspect of the value of Shmirat Haguf, which is to protect the body, right? Really to be mindful of what's happening with one's body. So that's part of it. The third question, I'm going to answer the third question about Ashkenazi food, because I had a whole part that we didn't get to today about Ashkenazi food. there's no such thing as Ashkenazi food, to be honest. I mean, we say that we call it Ashkenazi food, but actually it's completely connected to the foods where the immigrants were living.
Europe, yes.
So for the,
yes.
In that slideshow, there was a picture of apples and honey. And there's, the way people talk about apples and honey, you eat it on Rosh Hashanah. But that's not in the Bible. It didn't come down from Sinai with Moses to eat apples and honey. And it's a very Ashkenazi tradition. And the reason is because in Lithuania, it's apple season in October, and apples flooded the market. And there was just a plethora. So people just made everything with apples because that was what was that's what they had. So you ate all these apples. And when immigrants moved, they brought their foodways with them. And then because they were divorced from the original context, they became really connected with the Jewish and not the Lithuania. And it's similar with the Homentashen, because Tashen, Tashen just means pocket, right?
Yes, yes.
And it's really Hamantashen. Man is the German word for poppy, which is the traditional flavor for Homentashen. We added, it sounds like Haman's pocket or Haman, but it's Haman. It's a Yiddishism. Haman Tashen. It's a play on words. And then what we did was we stole the Hebrew Oznei Haman and then gave them our Central European poppy seed pastry, and then called it, the only food that you can eat on Purim. And another, there's a million examples of this. Another example, example would be gefilte fish, which is just, it's in the American parlance, it's, it's snout to tail when you eat the entire animal. So gefilte fish is a way to use up all of the fish. You ground up even the parts that you don't eat. But then when it's divorced from that, it's a poor person's food. When it's divorced from its context and we make it special because we're 2 or 3 or 4 generations and in a different geography, then we imbue different foods with special power, with special meaning, with special intention. And then that creates a new triangle. What do we value? We value tradition and not necessarily taste.
Sure. Bom, rapidamente eu perguntei se existiam pensadores clássicos que se relacionavam com este tipo de análise, e ela respondeu, disse que sim, muitos. Trouxe o exemplo de Maimônides, que era além de filósofo médico, que dizia que é importante cuidar do corpo para poder se relacionar com o espírito, e que se uma pessoa não consegue se concentrar na reza, que coma bem, que durma bem, que ande um pouco, e que isso estaria relacionado com a capacidade espiritual. Nachmanides Nachmanides sugeriria que a carne teria travas e a dieta vegetariana ajudaria mais ao fluxo do contato com o divino. Minha pergunta sobre as regras da kashrut e a ética, o aspecto ético da kashrut e outros costumes judaicos, e ela falou do conceito de eco-kashrut, que nos Estados Unidos é muito desenvolvido, onde se os processos não são socialmente sustentáveis, se não são sensíveis do ponto de vista social, então, para muitos, deixam de ser kasher. E por último, a questão das comidas que supostamente são tradicionais, se elas teriam algum apego a algum dos valores. Então, trouxe principalmente a resposta de que poderia, mas o principal é entender que essas comidas são tradicionais relativamente, não são da Torá. Não existe gefilte fish, nem knedler, nem ferfalach, nada disso na Torá, obviamente. Isso são adaptações a épocas e a regiões determinadas, em momentos determinados, por razões muitas vezes muito triviais. Okay, now we are getting to the last part, the questions of the audience. O que dizer sobre pessoas que na hora de cozinhar não economizam ingredientes? Opa, ok. Em que medida a eco-kashrut poderia ser uma valiosa contribuição judaica para judeus e não judeus? To what extent eco-kashrut, I think this she already answered. To what extent eco-kashrut could be a Jewish ethical contribution to Jews and non-Jews as regard to sustainability and protection of life? And another question, which leads the Jews to copy the feijoada, albeit with kosher components. Okay. And another one, and what about the Jewish values and the slow food movement?
Oh yeah, I love the slow food movement. What was that? I mean, what's interesting about Brazilian food is how Italian it is, and that the slow food movement comes from the Italian. It was adapted by Jews right away, this idea of slow food. But what was the middle question? I didn't hear the.
No, the middle question is which kind of impact, of influence do you think could come from the eco-kashrut values to the society, Jewish and not Jewish, both Jewish and non-Jewish as a whole?
So I thought I heard a question, and maybe I'm projecting the question of what the impact of Jewish food was in the sort of the larger Brazilian foodways. I don't know if I heard that question. And I don't have an answer to that. I know what it's doing in America, and I know what it's doing in Europe, and it all comes down to the bagel.
Okay.
And the bagel itself as an arbiter of Jewishness, because it's sort of being exported out to Europe as an American Jewish thing, even though it came from Europe. So but the role of eco-kashrut, I think there is an opportunity to be a moral leader, and I think there are different ways in which different denominations, the Orthodox, the Reform, and the Conservative, are sort of positioning themselves in global Jewry about how to really think more sort of religiously virtuous. I don't mean virtual, but how to be moral, really a moral exemplar, like the examples by which choosing better, more moral cooked food is a way of really leading a different kind of environment. And I think South America in particular is in a funny spot with kosher food, and particularly kosher meat, because so much of the global kosher meat market is in Brazil and also in Argentina. And if Brazilian and Argentinian Jews really put pressure on those ways of embodying Jewish values, like Tsar Ba'alei Chaim, then there's an opportunity to change the methods by which people consume meat. But I'm also not in a position to argue. Like I don't want to be an activist in this regard. But I think it's part of a landscape of decisions that people have to make when they think about how and why they're eating.
Okay, thank you. Nos vamos a ter que ir fechando. We are coming to our end, and we need to close. I think the answer was very encouraged and encourageous and interesting. A resposta basicamente era que as considerações de eco-kashrut ou de kashrut ética podem com certeza contribuir muito e que está nas nossas mãos, se nós vamos em nossa própria tradição, que pode ser aplicada de formas diferentes para dentro e para fora. Ela não quer se colocar no lugar de nos dizer a nós o que fazer quando ela não vai ser parte do processo, mas acha que a EcoCachú tem uma grandíssima oportunidade para contribuir com a sustentabilidade e com a sociedade, com a sustentabilidade como um todo. Eu vou tentar nos aproximarmos do final, realmente, porque estamos sem tempo mais. Aqui tem, ok, there are messages to say to you congratulations for your studies, and the people that love your explanation, your approach, your mode and also all the contents. I would like to add that there is I need to be the rabbi here. So I think that, first of all, it is very interesting and exciting to apply, as I said before, to apply the philosophy and the sociological categories to food, and from the food to come again to society and to religion and to philosophy, and try to bring a feedback and a sort of improvement each other. It is not just philosophy looking at food, but also food returning to philosophy and to sociology. This is very, very interesting and important. I have learned a lot. I think that I was feeling the whole time that there are two principles in Judaism, in the depth of Judaism, I think, that are very present in between the lines of your work. I don't know if you agree, but I think that one is the attempt to say that we are a whole, a unity. This is not a matter of guf v'nefesh, or guf and neshama. This is not just flesh and blood and spirit. That we are one unity, and we need to create harmony, not just existential, but also ethical and religious one. And this brings me to the second part, that the pasuk that say bechol derachecha daehu, that we are supposed to try to meet the divine in everything we do. Many times people think that we are just committed to the divine at the synagogue, and just when praying, or just with the Jews, or just with Israel. And this approach says, no, this is not the case. We need to do that when we are eating, and when we are sleeping, and when we are making business, love, and war. In every part of our life, of our being, of our doing, we have the opportunity to be better and more ourselves, or our yehud, or less. So I'm not sure if you agree or not, but this is one of the main things I reinforced, thanks you.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody. I mean, I appreciate it. It's very hard to teach, to little boxes on a screen, but I have really enjoyed people's facial expressions, and they have been so friendly and engaged and inspiring. And I just really want to thank this community for coming. It's been lovely. I've never been accused of being a chassid before, so I appreciate that very much. which I think is what you just did when you gave me the devekut, this idea of devekut,
Okay.
the detachment. But I'm not sure. I do believe in the integration and integrity, that there's a wholeness of approach. And I would always, yes, I feel very strongly about that. And everything that we do is a part of our larger identity. And I think it is interesting and exciting to think about ourselves as full of information, that we are all books and we are just waiting to be read.
Thank you. Para terminar, então, eu disse finalmente que na minha opinião, que eu agradeço muito o enfoque, que é essa contribuição de tentar trazer a filosofia, a sociologia para a comida, traz como resultado um caminho de volta também, porque a filosofia porque a comida traz também à filosofia e à sociologia alguns insights e a chacoalha e faz com que se definam de novo. E isso eu não tinha pensado antes, até não ter ouvido a professora doutora Leah Hochman. E depois disso eu acrescentei que eu ouço principalmente aqui, dois dos principais valores judaicos que acredito que existem no judaísmo. Um deles é a integridade entre corpo e alma, entre o espírito e a matéria. Isso se vê no fato de que a comida vai nos dizer coisas sobre a sociedade, a ética, a espiritualidade, os valores e demais. E a segunda coisa, o fato de que existe um versículo muito bonito nas nossas fontes que diz que em todos os caminhos você tem que reconhecer ou conhecer ou buscar o divino. O divino não se busca somente na reza, e não somente na sinagoga, e não somente com os judeus, e não somente no Shabat. Tem que se buscar e se procurar nas relações humanas, nos negócios, na forma de estudar, na forma de comer, na forma de dormir, na forma de fazer amor e guerra. Em todos esses lugares temos que buscar o divino e nossa identidade. E eu senti que este enfoque nos reforça nessas integridades. Perguntei se está certo ou não, e ela disse que se identifica muito com isso, que agradece que tenha trazido essa parte racídica, talvez, ao estudo dela, e que agradece muito a participação de todos vocês, que sentiu o entusiasmo de todos os que estavam aqui visíveis, e espera que o mesmo tenha acontecido com os que estavam no YouTube e no Facebook. I have translated, I hope, all what you said in part of what I said. Thank you again. Thank you so much. And we will receive you again to tell us a little more about ugly and pretty and ethics of that. Muito obrigado mais uma vez, e que possamos integrá-lo tudo, que possamos nos encontrar, né, fazendo essa busca pela autenticidade entre o material e o espiritual, o corpo e a alma, e que em todos os nossos caminhos, juntos e cada um separadamente, quando nos vem, quando não nos vem, encontremos e busquemos sempre o divino. Obrigado a todas e todos. Semana que vem eu vou contar a vocês o que me fascina da figura de Moisés. Estejam conosco. Tchau.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.